Welcome back to Java Space. Today we are beginning a brand new series on Spring Boot. So it seems that some developers use Spring Boot but do not really understand how Spring Boot was built or how Spring Boot works. So before we dive into details of Spring Boot, I want to begin with the introduction. So, what is Spring Boot? So, Spring Boot is basically an opinionated approach to developing Spring applications. So, what happens is that Spring developers, the developers of the framework, they impose their own opinions on you, but they still give you an option to override their opinions. So before Spring Boot, as a developer of Spring application, you needed to do a lot of setup. Like you were required to configure like many bins for you to even to do a basic, REST application, or you just want to do some basic things with Spring application. But you find yourself having to configure the dispatcher servlet, having to configure the handler mapping, the review resolvers, all those things that you may not really need to touch. You want to focus on what you want to solve. So the advantages of Spring Boot is that it reduces time in development and it increases your productivity. It makes it easier for you to develop Spring-based applications with Java because they have removed away that task of setting your configurations, like configuring the application. Before you could actually write what you want to do, like your business logic. I've already mentioned that you needed to do, if you are in a web, want to develop the web application before Spring Boot, you had to configure the dispatcher servlet, you had to configure the view resolver, you have to configure the handler mappings, all those things. And we're still, during the XML, you needed to write XML to do all those things. But with annotation-based configuration, or with this modern Spring, they have given us Spring Boot, which will wire all those things for us. We no longer need to do to actually do what we used to do before. And also, Spring is opinionated. So what does that mean? It means that Spring developers would give their own opinions on you, like would give you default configurations based on what you have in the class path, based on your configurations, based on your properties, like properties in a property file, based on environment variables, based on all these other variables. For instance, if you have Spring Boot Starter Web as a dependency in your Maven or Gradle, which obviously translates to it being in a class path, Spring will wire tomcat for you by default as an embedded, servlet container. They will wire it for you by default, and they will put it on port 88. So those are some of the opinions that Spring will impose on you. But the good thing is, while they have their own opinions, they still give you an option to override their opinions, or you can say override those configurable defaults. So if you have all these things, or you give all these variables to Spring, your class path, your property files, environment variables, profiles, and all that, Spring will try to guess how to configure your application based on all those conditions. So I've already mentioned the conditions. The conditions is you have classes in a class path. I've mentioned that if you have Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring will configure Tomcat for you, or by default in port 8080. You have profiles. Let's say you're in a local profile or local environment. You will want to set up your data source on H2. If you are in QA, you want to set your data source on some other database. If you are in production, you want to set it on a different database. So depending on the environment you're in, Spring will do some configurations for you. And also some environment variables, property files, in the property file. So these are some of the things that Spring will use to wire some beans for you. As I mentioned, so your own custom configuration as a developer has precedence over Spring default configuration. So Spring will respect your custom configurations. And for instance, if you have Spring Boot Starter JPA as a dependency, Spring will try to configure a couple of beans for you, like by default. Like it will configure a data source, entity manager factory bean, JPA transaction manager. Spring will try to do that for you. But now, if in your same Spring application, you define your own custom bean, which is the data source bean, Spring will not create a data source for you. It will create the entity manager factory bean, the JPA transaction manager for you. I got the spelling wrong here. JPA transaction manager. It will try to configure those two. It will configure those two for you, but data source, it will not configure it because you already have one, which means your beans now has precedence. Spring will respect that. So we are going to see all these conditions as we proceed with our series. Thank you.